Whether you grew up in the city, country, or suburbs, most of us have deep emotions imprinted in our memories as to the place where we're from. In BT's Neighborhood, we'll investigate two questions: who am I and whose am I? These questions, we hope, will point us in a more distinct direction of knowing how to live into the greatest commandment: to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. How can we love those around us, especially those who challenge or oppose us, if we don't even know who we are or how to express love for God, others, and ourselves? So take a walk with us, learn where to buy your groceries, and where to find a good conversation. This podcast is brought to you by Roberts Wesleyan University in conjunction with the Office of Spiritual Life. We want to welcome you to the neighborhood.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of BT's Neighborhood, a podcast right here on the campus of Roberts Wesleyan University. You know, this semester we have been talking about the theme, becoming. When we learn to be with God, who we are can come forth in natural ways. And so we've had some great movements within this theme. Now, I'm guessing that today's special podcast, we're going to probably touch on all of these a little bit, but I'm really grateful for today's guest. And this is kind of a special edition in honor of Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And not only that, but, you know, this podcast was in part this guest's idea. And so I'm so grateful he could be here with us. Folks, welcome with us today, Jae Newman.
Thank you for having me.
Jae, why don't you introduce yourself to the folks listening and let them know who you are and what you do on campus?
Jae Newman. I'm the Director of International Engagement. It means that I'm basically in charge of our international students coming in, and I also oversee the study abroad programs for our students going. It feels to me like it's a kind of crossroads of different cultures and identities, and that's certainly something that I've been interested in here at Roberts long before I entered the office about 2 years ago. I also teach creative writing on campus.
I know that you love stories. You know, us celebrating Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month is not only about those stories, but that those stories are part of the American story. Let me start here. And as a story person, why are these stories important for us to talk about?
There's places where if you grow up, you could walk down the street and see lots of people who you could identify with. And I don't just mean racially, I just mean like people who you feel like they understand you, they get you. You don't have to like change anything about yourself. You don't have to translate anything about yourself. You just, you feel like you connect and you're understood. Like in our country, we've had a lot of dialogue over the last 10 or 15 years about how that looks and how that feels for some people who don't necessarily have those experiences all the time. And I would just say, growing up as like an Asian American kid in a town where my sister and I and our neighbors, we were the only Korean kids in the whole town. We were the only minorities. So I didn't really have a lot of points of access to have any other thoughts. In fact, I was the oldest, and so I was supposed to know the most, it felt like, and I knew nothing. All I knew about my culture was what was in this little book that came with me. It was facts about Korea. Gee, I read that thing like 150 times.
Oh, wow.
And I used to memorize it. I would know like that the national sport was like soccer and taekwondo, you know, basic things. And for me, it was just, you know, it's pre-internet. The only context you have for a place that's on the other side of the world is what you're seeing in a book. So
Wow.
that was the only way it was true.
Now, how old were you when you were reading that? And
Yeah, so it started when I was adopted before I was 1. So
okay.
I grew up and I only knew English. It's all I have is little scattered bits of Korean that I've kind of picked up. For me, I asked more questions when I started going to school, and I'd have these different encounters where kids would say things. And most of the time, it's just the same kind of stuff that all kids deal with.
Yeah.
And, you know, my parents did a good job, I think, overall, trying to just say, like, if they say something rude or whatever, it's just because they're jealous. But, you know, that only gets you so far, I think, until you realize, like, when I was also a soccer player, high school soccer player, and you go around and these people kind of don't know you from anyone else, and you hear different things, and some of it wasn't really wholesome or wonderful. And I started to kind of have a picture of myself as someone who, well, why would they be jealous of me? They don't know me, you know?
Yeah.
And the kind of younger narrative that I had of the way things were working in the world, it wasn't fitting anymore. And so by the time I was in 5th grade, I started to have doubts about how my parents kind of saw things. I think growing up a lot, there was a tendency to want to make things not about race. We're all the same, there's no color.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of teachers who kind of talk that way, they do it out of love, but they also do it out of blindness because they've never really known what it's like to kind of go into a room and you're the only
Yeah.
you're the only person that looks like you in the room. That's been basically like my whole life. It's a unique and kind of startling kind of thing. In fact, I'll tell you this one story because I like stories. The first time that I was ever surrounded by Asians was when my sister, who's Korean as well, she and I were like at one of those rest stops when you're like driving on the highway and you have to eat like McDonald's. We were at like one of those rest stops, and you might see these like tour buses that have like they're from China or Japan, kind of touring the country. Well, one stopped at the rest stop where we were, and just my sister and I just sitting there, probably talking about like Ninja Turtles or Sonic the Hedgehog or something. And all these Asians come in and they just start like filling this cafeteria where we're eating. That's the first time where like she and I were like looking around and we're like, whoa, this is
Oh, wow.
this is the first time this has ever happened. I would just say, like, for some people who can't imagine how disorienting or strange that is, I would just say that for me, it was a kind of moment where I realized what, like, to some extent, I never experienced before. My wife had a similar experience when we went to Korea in 2010. I went on a short-term missions trip, and we went to the very same orphanage where I had been dropped off by my birth mom. She basically come to the same room where that had happened. So that was a pretty powerful experience. But while we were there, Tasha and I were walking down into this bookstore. She kind of like walked into this kind of Barnes and Noble-ish kind of store, and there was just like tons of Koreans just like hanging out, reading, studying, and she got it for the first time, like because there she is. My wife, if you don't know her, she's British, as my kids like to say. She's sticking out, and she's kind of feeling like the everyday experience for me and for a lot of other folks too. And so I would just say these stories matter because for a lot of people, they're rare. And anything that's kind of rare has an intrinsic value, I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I can remember times myself of just walking. Well, it happens all the time. I think it's W.E.B. Du Bois who calls it double consciousness. This idea that I'm always aware of the fact that I'm different, and having to live with that and trying to, in my case, justify it all the time. And sometimes you could be made to feel like you're the one that's creating a problem because you're aware that there are some differences.
Even at like 9 or 10, I was starting to think through things, and like it did make sense, like the way that people try to portray you on a page or describe you in a word or a term.
Yeah.
Asian American is something that I don't even know what it means.
Yeah.
I've been living in it for 40 plus years.
Yeah. There's so much more to who you are and who we are as people. Your work on campus, it seems that, and I know that it's true, that your past experiences have shaped you in such a way that me knowing you, there has to have been a lot of thought into your experiences, and now how you respond and work with other students. What would you say are some of the ways that your past has helped you bring that to today's work with students?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think for me growing up, I was a community builder. I was on my soccer team. It was important for me to be inclusive and like make a thing that mattered, that people cared about, and that it felt good to belong to. Like through most of my life, even like through my church experiences and the different places I've been, we've hosted small groups or invited students over to our house. And for a large part, I would say like to find community, I had to make it. I had to be somebody who would kind of go out and take those steps to initiate those relationships. But on this campus, that I have this interest in just wanting people to feel like they belong and that they have people that they can connect with. As a first-year student at a liberal arts school in Ohio, I remember feeling this most odd kind of feeling come over me my freshman year of college when I remember thinking, no one knows that I'm American here, not one person. So I was there, I was on the men's soccer team, I had a really decorated high school soccer career. Yeah. I was just this like Asian kid that people were going to kind of assume couldn't speak English. And there I was, an English major, there I was like dead set at 18, someone who was going to become an author. And I knew it, but it didn't matter. And so for me, in my work and what I do in like a classroom or through my office, I try to see like a larger range of who someone is. Yeah. And I try to allow them to have room to express that part of who they are, because I know what it's like to kind of be minimized and to not really be seen for the fullness of who you are.
Yeah, it's so strange. It's a paradox because you're seen, but yet you're highly invisible. Things about you based on your sight, but you're like, I've got this whole other side to me that you still don't know me as a person.
Yeah, I think so. And I think like for a lot of us, just our different personalities, we are a little bit guarded about like revealing our true self. But like, I think even for me, like to a certain extent, when I'm around campus, like I still like, I want to be seen as someone who's responsible and somebody who's going to do the right things for his office and the students that he serves and stuff. But I also want to be able to like tell jokes and like, yeah. I think the people who know me the most know that like that's who I am. There's a tendency for a lot of us to kind of just see a person, and if we already kind of have our group of or our people that we belong with in our connection, our clique, then they're easy just to kind of set aside and see as like, well, that's great. I'm glad that those people are here on our campus, but I'm not really gonna be curious about finding out more about them. Even if there's more to discover in those relationships that could really, in some ways, change and challenge us to become better versions of who we want to be.
Wow. One of the things that I appreciate about you is that, is watching students respond to you. Like you are probably one of the most loved people on this campus by students. And I think that's because you do see them, but then you engage them in a way that brings value to them, lets them know that they're important. And I can say that because I've worked with you in a close capacity, and I've been able to see that. And I appreciate that, and that's one of the things that I have learned and am learning from you. I think sometimes the busyness of trying to get things done, we put people into these nice little boxes, and we move on in order to get stuff done, but we really don't take the time to treat people like the persons they are. And I think that's something that we can do better at, not only as a campus, but just as human beings.
Most of the time, students now live in this world where they feel they need to prove themselves, and they need to come out of the package of college already something. And I'm so dead set against that in terms of them putting that pressure on themselves, because I know that they're gonna be who they are, and I just want them to have a little more like grace for themselves, because no one graduates at 22 and has the whole thing worked out. And I see so many students trying to get the grades, and I see so many people hustling to be in so many clubs so that it has a certain look or feel to it. And I just want them to slow down, put slowness and intentionality into what they're doing, because I feel like that's the missing thing. Most people's schedules, slowing down. I make people read poetry for part of my job. If you're not slowing down, then everything loses its value, because everything stays at breakneck pace.
Man, you reminded me of a story I had with a student when I worked in a local high school in Rochester. And I was kind of teasing this kid. We were talking about, music. And it was kind of the thing I was intentionally being like, oh, you young whippersnappers don't know what real music is. And we were just kind of laughing. And so I told him I wanted him to listen to some John Coltrane. And he was like, oh, I could do that easily. I was like, no, you couldn't do it. I was like, you need a beat, And so he took it. He took the CD. That's how long ago this was. He took the CD and he was like, okay, I'm going to listen to it. And as a joke, I said, okay, and then write me a one-page report on it when you finish. And just laughed. And he came back the next day and left the CD and the one-page report on my desk. And I was kind of shocked. And, as I read it, he said that when he first started to play the music, he just thought, this is too slow. I can't do it. And so he stopped. But then he was like, no, I'm going to do this. And he let it play again. And he said that it was so slow that it caused him to actually slow down and think about his life. And he was like, that was the first time that he had spent some time reflecting on decisions that he's made and what's transpired in his life. And he realized, like, wait a minute, the music that I listen to is so fast-paced that I don't slow down enough, Yeah. And so I feel like that's kind of what you're, getting at here about slowing down. You brought some works of art with you today here. You brought a book that you wrote. Why don't you introduce that to our listeners and maybe share something with us here?
So I wrote a book of poems when I was in college, and sure that it was going to win every award imaginable in the entire country. And I was so shocked that it didn't happen. But what happened was I started this 10-year trek to turn this book that was really just a bunch of sad poems about wanting to be connected to a birth family. And it became a completely different book. So the book became more about how God keeps his promises, and how when I was a kid and I would see an airplane, it would elicit a kind of almost like a hardness in me where I would get upset, especially on the days where identity-wise, I didn't feel like I fit in with other kids. I was always more quiet. I was always more I don't want to come off sounding the wrong way, but higher achieving, because it was in me that I didn't want to fail, because I felt like I was given such a great gift to be able to be here. But I remember just this kind of movement where to finish the book, I had to have that trip to Korea and meeting my birth mother, and then discovering that the book was really about becoming this unnamed orphan to naming my own kids, and how God was giving me the space and time to be able to write the book of poems that I was going to write, and not just a book, which I was ready to do 10 years ago, Lord, but you didn't want to do that. I'll just read one poem. I'll read this first poem. It's called Apartment Near Airport. We used to live at this apartment in Rochester that it felt like we were in the direct path of the planes that they would fly like right over our house. And this is the poem. Soft words folded into envelopes of prayer. The dogs hear it first. Not my prayer, but the sound of shadows in the neighboring trees. I can feel the shadow of the engine before I hear it. Body at rest, I wrestle with God, nurse wounds in the dark. Bracing for the heavy presence of the plane, I cringe in its sound, crawl out, holding wings while still hips rust, to reveal a man who was never a child, a man who wanders airports alone at night, attracted to the ebb and flow of runways, where beneath the grindings of identity, there's comfort in the fading echo, the tail of the plane vanishing into layers of mysterious clouds.
I'll confess, I came in with the mindset of leaning into your Asian heritage, but now hearing the layers of, identity and that of man, okay, there's a part of that you're connecting to, but then the deeper of man, my family, that whole piece. And, this semester, as we've talked about, becoming, identity formation is just such a major part of that, of answering the question, who am I? Wanting to know who you are, but also wanting to be known by others. And there's some elements of that I hear in that poem. But what were some of the things that you were contrasting in that poem?
I think what was most important to me, like around 2005 or whenever I wrote that poem, was that I think when you're trying to draw close to God and you're trying to pray, I think sometimes words get in the way. We feel these things. They're already in us. We can kind of like just let them kind of float up to him in my own mind of praying. Sometimes I think we make it sound holier or more emotional when it's already there. So I remember just feeling like the answers were en route and there was nothing else that I had to do. I think for anyone who is working through something as a Christian, having like doubts or having hard feelings about how things feel in a moment, I think that's what I wanted the poem to kind of do, to express that you can bring all that. You can be completely unable to sleep. You can feel miserable inside.
Yeah.
And you can still feel intrinsically drawn to a hope because you believe it. You believe it to be true. Because when I think about the things that generally people just want to be able to share their story and be themselves and be accepted for that. I think some people don't tell their story because there's just so much going on and it gets blocked. I would just say for AAPI month, like the thing that I just want to get across is that some people don't feel like they have permission to tell their story because it's going to make them other. It's going to make them seem weaker. And I just want all people to be able to kind of put your guard down just a little. Because when we put our guard down, I feel like that's where God can work in that space.
Yeah, I can't say any more than what you've said and the gift that you've given us here today. Folks, that's Professor Jae Newman, one of, I would say, the most compassionate men I know on campus. And if you see him around, strike up a conversation, say hello to him. Jay, thanks for being our guest, and I hope this podcast has been meaningful for you. If it is, reach out, let us know, and I hope you've been blessed by this podcast. Shout out to Amanda for being behind the controls, and we'll see you next time in BT's Neighborhood.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of BT's Neighborhood, where we aim for simple but deep conversations about being a good neighbor here and now at Roberts Wesleyan, and wherever our paths take us in the future.